October 20th, 1977. What began as just another night on tour would end as one of the darkest moments in rock history. Lynyrd Skynyrd, the southern rock powerhouse riding high off the release of Street Survivors, had just ignited a crowd in Greenville, South Carolina. Their fame was peaking, their legacy still being written. But as the band boarded a worn-down charter plane for their next show in Baton Rouge, fate was already circling overhead. In just a few hours, that plane would fall from the sky, tearing through trees, silence, and the very heart of American rock. This is not just a story of a crash. It's a story of warnings ignored, of lives cut short, and of a chilling premonition that turned out to be true. In the fall of 1977, Lynyrd Skynyrd wasn't just a band, they were a movement. With hits like Sweet Home Alabama, Gimme 3 Steps, and Freebird, they had become the loud, unapologetic voice of the American South. And now, with their newest album, Street Survivors, hitting the shelves on October 17th, they were preparing to reach a whole new level of fame. The album cover itself showed the band engulfed in flames, a haunting image that would take on a new meaning just days later. Street Survivors was raw, defiant, and electric. It was the sound of a band unafraid to confront its own demons. And on stage, they were tighter than ever. Their October 19th show in Greenville was a triumph, a high-octane performance that left the crowd breathless. The energy, the swagger, the grit. It felt like nothing could stop them. But something was already wrong. Behind the curtain of fame, a sense of unease had begun to settle in the camp, because just hours after that triumphant show, the band would step onto a plane that had no business flying. The decision was meant to save time, not cost lives. To keep up with the demanding tour schedule, Lynyrd Skynyrd had rented a Convair CV-240, a 30-year-old twin-engine aircraft well past its prime. It was loud, clunky, and battered by years of wear, but it was cheap, and it could get them from town to town faster than any tour bus. The problem? It was never meant for the road they were on. Just a few months earlier, Aerosmith's management had inspected the very same plane and walked away horrified. They reported that the crew was drinking during the evaluation, a red flag they wouldn't ignore. Their tour manager pulled the plug immediately. No way our guys are flying in that thing. That decision may have saved their lives. But Lynyrd Skynyrd didn't walk away. By October 18th, just one day before the crash, the warning signs were undeniable. During a flight to Greenville, one of the engines began violently sputtering, trailing sparks and smoke through the night sky. Cassie Gaines, one of the band's backing vocalists, was so shaken she begged to ride in the band's equipment truck instead. Even bandmates started to raise alarms. Ronnie Van Zant, however, remained determined to stay on schedule, unwilling to cancel dates or let the band's momentum fade. And so, with fear in their eyes and fate closing in, they boarded that same plane again. The morning of October 20th began like any other on tour, a blur of packing, moving, and chasing the next stage light. No one knew it would be the last time Lynyrd Skynyrd would ever board a plane together. After a blistering show the night before in Greenville, the band was scheduled to perform next in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The flight wasn't long, just over 700 miles, and the plan was simple. Load up the gear, get in the air, and arrive before nightfall. 26 people climbed aboard that afternoon, including band members, crew, and a handful of associates. Some joked, some napped, some played cards to pass the time. Ronnie Van Zant was one of the last to step on board. Some witnesses later recalled that before climbing the steps, he turned to Cassie Gaines, still uneasy about flying, and said, "If it's your time, it's your time." Though the quote has circulated widely, it has never been officially confirmed by a band member. Still, it lingers in the lore surrounding that day. Ronnie settled into the back aisle, laid his head on a pillow, and closed his eyes. The Convair rose into the sky. For the first stretch, everything seemed normal, but inside the cockpit, something wasn't right. The pilots were watching their fuel gauges, and what they saw didn't make sense. They had planned for enough fuel, but the numbers were dropping fast. And somewhere just past the halfway point, they realized they weren't going to make it. The plane had been airborne for just over an hour. Somewhere near the Mississippi border, the flight crew noticed something alarming. The fuel gauges were dipping far lower than they should have. Captain Walter McCreary and co-pilot William Gray began troubleshooting, trying to transfer fuel from one tank to another. But in a critical miscalculation, they mistakenly jettisoned the remaining fuel. The plane was now empty. At approximately 6:42 p.m., the right engine failed, the same engine that had emitted flames on a previous flight. Moments later, the left engine gave out too. The aircraft had no power, no thrust, just a slow, quiet descent over heavily wooded terrain. In the cabin, drummer Artemis Pyle, seated toward the rear, noticed the shift. He later described a tense silence settling across the passengers as the propellers sputtered and stopped. The band and crew were told to brace, but few knew just how dire things really were. McCreary and Gray aimed for a nearby open field just outside Gillsburg, Mississippi. They radioed an emergency, but were rapidly losing altitude. The aircraft was descending at over 2,000 feet per minute. They had no landing gear, no lights, and no visibility beneath the trees. At 6:52 p.m., the Convair 240 clipped a tree line and slammed into the forest. The impact tore the aircraft into pieces over a stretch of nearly 500 feet. Seats were ripped from the floor. Wings and engines were sheared off. The cockpit broke away entirely. Of the 26 people on board, 6 were killed instantly. When the Convair finally came to a stop, it lay in ruins. Its fuselage twisted, torn, and scattered across a swampy thicket in Gillsburg, Mississippi. For those who survived the impact, what followed was a waking nightmare. Drummer Artemis Pyle, despite multiple broken ribs and severe trauma, crawled from the wreckage. Disoriented and bleeding, he stumbled through dense woods in search of help. Eventually, he reached a nearby farmhouse, but in the fading light, his sudden approach startled the property owner, who fired a warning shot and accidentally struck Pyle in the shoulder. Only when Pyle cried out the words, "Plane crash," did the man realize the truth and rushed to assist. Meanwhile, back at the crash site, chaos reigned. Guitarist Gary Rossington lay unconscious under part of the fuselage, having suffered 2 broken arms, a broken leg, a shattered pelvis, and internal injuries. Keyboardist Billy Powell was thrown forward on impact, his face torn open by metal debris and his teeth shattered. He later recalled crawling through the wreckage and tripping over the body of Steve Gaines in the dark. The band's road manager, Dean Kilpatrick, was killed instantly, as were both pilots. Cassie Gaines and her brother, guitarist Steve Gaines, also perished at the scene. Ronnie Van Zant, the band's frontman and founder, was thrown from the plane and died from blunt force trauma to the head. He was 29 years old, just weeks away from his 30th birthday. Rescue teams arrived only after emergency calls were relayed through local authorities. With no fire or smoke to guide them, helicopters and first responders had difficulty locating the wreckage in the thick pine forest. It took hours to extract survivors and transport them to nearby hospitals. Of the 26 people on board, 20 survived, but none without injury, and none without trauma that would last a lifetime. Long before the crash, Ronnie Van Zant had carried a sense of looming fate, and those closest to him never forgot it. Multiple members of Lynyrd Skynyrd would later confirm that Ronnie spoke often about dying young. Artemis Pyle, the band's drummer, recalled a conversation during a tour stop in Tokyo. Ronnie told him directly, "I'll never live to see 30. I'll go out with my boots on." It was a phrase he repeated more than once, even in casual settings. His father, Lacey Van Zant, also remembered these warnings. In an interview years after the crash, Lacey said, "He'd tell me, 'Daddy, I won't live to be 30 years old.'" When Lacey asked him why, Ronnie simply replied, "That's my limit." Even his wife, Judy Van Zant, acknowledged that the singer seemed to have made peace with his destiny. In her words, "He talked about it so many times, I came to believe that he somehow knew." It's difficult to explain and impossible to forget, but in hindsight, many saw his attitude not as recklessness, but as acceptance. A man who lived hard, sang louder, and never blinked at the thought of dying on the road. On October 20th, 1977, 87 days before his 30th birthday, Ronnie's haunting prediction came true. In the wake of the tragedy, the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, launched an immediate investigation. Their findings, released months later, painted a grim picture, not of sabotage, weather, or mechanical explosion, but of human error and negligence. The official cause of the crash was fuel exhaustion. Both engines failed, not because of catastrophic mechanical breakdown, but because the flight crew failed to properly monitor and manage the aircraft's fuel supply. According to the NTSB's final report, the right engine had been consuming more fuel than expected, likely due to a minor malfunction. But the crew didn't notice the imbalance in time. In a desperate attempt to correct it mid-air, they mismanaged the fuel transfer system, accidentally releasing the remaining fuel overboard. Contributing to the disaster were inadequate flight planning and poor communication. No formal fuel consumption calculations had been verified prior to takeoff, and the aircraft had no reliable fuel gauge system. The NTSB did not find a major mechanical failure in either engine, suggesting the malfunction in the right engine was likely minor, possibly involving the induction or ignition system. In short, the plane didn't fall because it broke. It fell because the people flying it ran out of fuel, a preventable tragedy caused by oversight, paid for in blood. The crash of October 20th, 1977 didn't just end lives. It shattered a band, a brotherhood, and a generation's Southern rock anthem. But the heartbreak didn't stop there. In the years that followed, Lynyrd Skynyrd's surviving members struggled to recover, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Guitarist Alan Collins, who had suffered severe injuries in the crash, returned to music, but never fully healed. In 1986, tragedy struck again. Collins was paralyzed from the waist down in a car accident that also claimed the life of his girlfriend. He died 4 years later from chronic pneumonia, a complication of that paralysis. Bassist Leon Wilkeson, who had also survived the crash despite critical injuries, remained active in the band's later iterations. But in July 2001, he was found dead in a hotel room in Florida. The cause was a combination of chronic liver disease and complications from emphysema. Keyboardist Billy Powell, who had vividly described the moments after the crash, died in 2009 from a heart attack at his home in Florida. He had called 911, complaining of difficulty breathing, but passed away before paramedics arrived. And then, in 2023, the last remaining original member, guitarist Gary Rossington, passed away. Though his cause of death was not publicly confirmed, Rossington had battled heart disease for years, including multiple bypass surgeries and a reported heart attack in 2015. With Rossington's passing, the final link to the original Lynyrd Skynyrd lineup was gone. A story that began with defiance and fire, ended with silence.
If I leave here tomorrow.
Lynyrd Skynyrd is no longer the band it once was, but its spirit never left the stage. With over 30 million albums sold and anthems like Free Bird and Sweet Home Alabama etched into rock history, their music outlived the wreckage. In 2006, the original band was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a final recognition for a sound that helped define a generation. But for those who knew them, it was never just about the music. It was about grit, brotherhood, and a refusal to back down, even in the face of tragedy.